Welcome to this Advanced HE exercise webinar. My name is Diane Nutt and I'm here with Holly Earle. We're going to talk to you about preparing and working on the exercise for reviewing NTFS. Just to briefly outline what we're going to cover in this short video, it will be about 15 to 20 minutes, and what we're going to do is provide some guidance for you before doing the training exercise. This is to help you so that you feel comfortable doing the training exercise, but we're also going to highlight some key issues which you might find useful for future reviewing. We're going to really cover 4 areas, and the order in which we're covering them replicates to some degree the best order for doing reviewing. So we're going to start by talking about the nominee's context. And when you are reviewing, you will start by thinking about the nominee's context before you actually look at the evidence they're providing. You then look at the evidence, and we're going to talk in this session about what is evidence and how to make some assessments around that. We'll then talk about writing clear feedback, because when you're reviewing, you'll look at that evidence, write some notes or draft feedback based on each criteria before you go on to score. So we're going to talk about writing clear feedback briefly. And then lastly, we're going to consider how to score against the rubric and using the criteria, using your own feedback against that scoring rubric. So we'll say a bit more about that when we get there. But that's the kind of structure of this session. Next slide, please, Holly.
Thanks, Di. So I'm just going to start us off by very briefly taking a look at the criteria for the National Teaching Fellowship Scheme. So you'll see here that there are the claims for the NTFS are marked against 3 criteria. If we think first about the purpose of the NTFS, this award is intended to recognise and celebrate individuals who have made an outstanding impact on student outcomes and the teaching profession. So NTFS applicants submit a claim against the 3 criteria which are here and which align with that purpose that we've got in mind. So criteria 1 is all around the individual excellence of the claimant. So they can demonstrate the impact they've made on student outcomes and or the teaching profession. Criteria 2 is all about how that excellent individual has raised the profile of excellence. This might be in terms of supporting colleagues or influencing support for students. And criteria 3 is all about how they have developed excellence. So how the nominee has demonstrated excellence in their own professional development. So all I've gone through there is a very kind of top-line summary of the 3 NTFS criteria. So we really encourage you to engage with the reviewer guidance, where you'll find much more detail on these 3 criteria, and it will help you to understand what is and what isn't appropriate evidence under each. So thank you for that. I'm now just going to very briefly talk about context in relation to the NTFS awards. We've included this slide just to try to make the point for you that successful nominees for NTFS come from a really wide variety of roles and contexts. There's no one kind of background or no one set of experiences that a successful NTFS must have. So I won't go through all the examples there. I'll let you perhaps pause and have a look at that in your own time. But the really key focus behind this list that we provided is trying to remind you as reviewers that when you review, it's really important not to focus on the role of the nominee per se, because there's a really wide diversity of roles that NTFS applicants come from, but rather to really focus on what kind of evidence they can provide to address the criteria. And there are many different ways that they can do this. Context remains really important within the review process, and we've tried to divide it into two kind of key ways of thinking about context in relation to NTFS. So the first on the left is all about the nominee's context. The NTFS claims start with a 300-word context statement, which gives the nominee the opportunity to outline the kind of environment that they work in, who their learners are, and kind of the remit of their role. So it's very important as reviewers to engage with that carefully and to carry that through into the review process. So we want to assess the evidence that you find in relation to the nominee's context, as outlined in the context statement, and in relation to the criteria. So you can see that it's all about the impact that they make within the context that they're operating in. We also want you to try to be mindful of your own context as a reviewer. So thinking carefully about how your own context, your own kind of history and the different work that you've done might influence the way that you provide scores and feedback for the NTFS claims. Being mindful of both the context statement, using that to help you, and also the institutional statement of support, which you would receive if you were participating in the real NTFS review. So being mindful of context from those two perspectives is really important as a reviewer. I'm going to hand you back to Di now.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you assess evidence. But before I do, I'd just like to highlight that this video is short, and we are speaking briefly to each of the slides that we're showing. But if you need a little bit longer to take in some of what's on the slides, or if you would like to kind of revisit any of the ideas that we're discussing, do feel free to pause the video or replay it so that you can actually take in what we're saying more easily. We've tried to keep it short so that we're not sort of wasting any of your time, but it is also a chance for you to go back and watch bits of it again, or to read things in a bit more detail. So I'm going to talk a little bit about examples versus evidence, and I kind of emphasized here the idea that versus evidence, and that it's important to focus on evidence rather than examples. But what does that mean? Well, when you're reviewing a claim, and if you go on to review, you will probably see half a dozen claims when you're in the final review process, and you will see some exciting examples of practice in some of those claims. You might see several exciting examples of practice, and we can quite often be seduced by the excitement of some of those examples, and step away from that when you're reviewing and think about what evidence they've provided to support those examples. So some examples may be much more mundane, but the evidence is very strong. And you're kind of weighing up the issues around evidence to try and score effectively the individual's practice against the criteria. What does that mean? What you're looking for is evidence of change in relation to HE teaching and or learning support. How has the nominee's work changed student experience, or changed student learning, or changed their colleagues' practice? You're looking for that evidence of change. You're looking for explicit descriptions of practice which have made a difference to student learning. You're looking for explicit descriptions of activity which have enhanced teaching practice in HE. You're looking for evidence of reach, value, and impact from the nominee's practice against the criteria. But what you've got to remember is you will be stimulated and thrilled by some of the practice, I hope, and we'll see some really exciting things in some of the claims. And when you see that, just ask yourself, what is the evidence that these examples have impacted on student learning, or HE teaching practice, or learning support, or teaching policy? So what's the evidence that they've impacted? And if you're not seeing quite enough evidence, but there are exciting examples, it's fine to say in the feedback that the examples are good examples, that there is some really interesting work going on here. But what evidence would you like to see to show that positive change has occurred? Next slide, Holly. And this slide is there for you to look at in a bit more detail later. And it basically highlights the types of evidence that you might see in some claims. You will never see all of this evidence in one claim. It will be impossible. Nobody could write that long a claim, and nobody could have that range of experience and evidence to draw on. But if you're trying to decide what sort of evidence would be useful, looking at this slide can give you some ideas on the sort of evidence you might ask for. So we encourage you to look at this in a bit more detail, to pause the video and take it in a little bit. Next slide, Holly. This diagram is in the guidance for you to look at more closely, but I'm just going to talk it through to explain it a little bit more. Because basically, when you're reviewing, you will get a claim, and that claim will have come from a nominee who an institution has seen as excellent. They've defined them as excellent within their own institution. They stand out where they are, and that's why the institution has selected them. So you know that they are already seen as excellent, but the only evidence you have to review and consider is the claim that they have written. You're looking for reach, value, and impact within that claim. And you're effectively starting at zero and reading that claim, building score based on the evidence that you're seeing. But you're doing that with a generous heart. You're doing that with a recognition that this is hard work to do this claim, and are they bringing out evidence that you can reward with a higher score, and you can explore what that evidence is in the description, in the feedback that you're writing. So you're asked to be positive and generous in recognising evidence of reach, value and impact, and it will vary between claims. Next slide, Holly. Over to Holly.
So I'm going to go through a couple of slides to think about feedback at this stage. The first slide here you can see is all about best practice with regards to writing feedback for NTFS. So this is kind of insights which we've collected over many years of working with NTFS reviewers. The second slide I'm going to show you is kind of the other side of the coin. So this is insights we've collected into things to avoid as an NTFS reviewer. I'm going to skip over that one fairly quickly and you'll have a chance to pause and look at it. But first of all, I'm going to highlight a few points on this slide about best practice of NTFS feedback. So it's really important to first kind of acknowledge that the written feedback that you provide to NTFS nominees is extremely important. And this is particularly true as nominees do not receive their scores. So the feedback that you write will be shared directly with them and with senior colleagues at that institution on an anonymous basis. As I'm sure you'll agree, it's really important that all nominees that come forward for NTFS derive benefit from that process, whether they're successful or not. And this is where the feedback comes in as a really important source which will support their future development. So in addition to these points that I'm going to look at now, we really encourage you to look carefully at the feedback section of the reviewer guidance document, where you'll find lots of sources of kind of help and support. And in particular, the exemplar feedback resource, which is in Appendix 2. So there you'll find exemplar pieces of feedback for each of the NTFS criteria at each of the scoring points. So hopefully that'll be really helpful for you. So looking at this slide in a bit more detail now. Some of the points we've gathered here are quite straightforward, but nevertheless really important. We ask that you address your feedback to the nominee directly. So that means using second person, you, your. We want you to please ensure that your comments are positively framed, even if they are developmental. And there's help again in the reviewer guidance with developing that kind of style. And we ask that you please adopt a clear and informative style, writing in plain English. So some points are a little bit more subtle, but nevertheless really important to the effectiveness of your feedback for NTFS applicants. Please try to ensure that your developmental points are specific and actionable. So if you want to ask, for example, for more evidence of impact, it's then really useful to try to give a couple of specific examples of the evidence types which might make the difference in the score for you. You might wish to refer to that slide which Di was just talking about, the different evidence types to do this. It's very helpful to bring in the individual's context as appropriate into your feedback, which really helps it to make sense for them. But a really crucial feature of effective NTFS feedback is accurate alignment. So by this, we mean feedback which is written in a way that aligns clearly with the NTFS criteria, that clearly relates to elements of that, and also feedback which is carefully and accurately aligned with the score that you've selected. As I've said, the nominees don't receive the scores, a copy of the scores, but nevertheless, we want to make sure that the written feedback that they look at aligns with those accurately. So to assist you with this, it's kind of reflecting on that process that Di talked about at the very beginning, where we ask you to try to draft your feedback first, then return to it and think about a best match score. So those are just some key points to think about for best practice for feedback. I'll now very briefly just show this slide, which gathers together some points to avoid. And I encourage you to pause and have a look at some of these as you go through the process. So now I'm going to hand back over to Di, who's going to talk to us a bit about scoring for NTFS.
This slide is basically a summary of the kind of scoring that you will see on the rubric and that you're working with. On the left, you will see a kind of question, which score and why. And I've listed here the different scores that are available to you, and you'll see that some of these scores are paired. With the relatively new rubric, we've been using this for about 18 months, 2 years now. With this rubric, you have a pairing option for 1 or 2 points, 3 or 4 points, 5 or 6, 7 or 8. The only individual points are 0 or 9. You are unlikely to give many, if any, 0s or 9 for any criteria that you read. I'll say a little bit more about 9 in a moment or two, but it's unusual to ever give a 0 because, as I said earlier, each of the nominees that you are reading a claim from is identified as excellent in their institution. They are likely to have something that they can put in as evidence. So you are unlikely to give a 0 unless someone has really gone completely off target altogether. The reason we have this pairing of scores is to help you differentiate so that when you're looking at a claim and you think it's good with some very good, you can choose between giving it a 5 or a 6, depending on how much very good you're seeing in that particular criterion. On the right, you will see reach, value, and impact are mentioned here. These are the 3 things that you're thinking about when you're reviewing. There's more guidance on them in the guidance documents that we've shared with you. But I just want to pick up on reach briefly, because I think this one can be particularly challenging for people. What we're getting at here is the scale of influence. Now, sometimes people think reach is about geographical reach, and it can be. It may be that some individuals are spreading their practice and impact quite widely on a national or international basis. And that is a version of reach, but don't get caught up too much with that, because depending on their context, that may not be something they have the opportunity to do. So, for example, a professional services member of staff may not have the chance to do international work, for example, but they may have an influence and impact on people or groups within their institution that other people have not been able to reach. And that may be a significant evidence base for their claim. All of this is you scoring against the criteria and relative to the nominee's context. You are juggling a lot of different things here, and it can be hard. So we know we're asking you something difficult, but we hope you enjoy reading the claims and making these scoring matches. Next slide, please, Holly. This is the scoring rubric. It's small print, but it is in the guidance, so you can look at it there. But I just wanted to show you it, just to kind of show you how it might work. So, for example, when you're reading a claim and you've written some feedback for criterion 1, and you take that feedback and you look across criterion 1 and you think, right, well, what I'm seeing here is some good evidence of them having enhanced student outcomes and having a positive impact. So there's some good evidence, but, you know, I'd like to see a little bit more strength of evidence. So for me, that's probably a 3 or a 4. Some good evidence, well, actually, it's quite, some of it has great potential. So I'm inclined to give it a 4. So that's kind of where you're going, looking at what you've written in the guidance. Next slide, please, Holly. Very briefly, I just want to, as I come back to the exceptional 9. The 9 was introduced as an opportunity for you to be able to sort of reward those really remarkable examples of a criterion that you occasionally see. So when you see something that really is remarkable and stands out in its and is rare in its quality, you might want to give it a 9. However, if you're seeing an excellent claim that absolutely satisfies the criteria for you and is doing great stuff, that can be a 7 or an 8. It can be an 8 without having any development points at all. And 9 is really only to be used when you're seeing something unexpected and exceptional. If you do, please make sure that in your feedback, you identify what is exceptional. You don't just say this is exceptional, but you specify what it is about that criterion that is exceptional. Thanks, Holly. Next slide.
Thanks, Di. I'm just going to finish off this short video by bringing together some of the key points that we've gone through. So the key things to remember as you approach this review is to begin by focusing on the criteria, make sure you're really familiar with that and the information on that in the guidance document. Remember and consider the context which your nominee is coming from and your own context as well. Think again about how you're going to identify the evidence of reach, value, and impact against each criterion as you go through. At this point, have a go at writing that feedback using the guidance available. And then as the kind of final step, match your feedback to an appropriate score. You probably then would want to go back again and have another look and just do any kind of final tweaks. You'll see that next to each of these steps, there's a comment there in purple, and that is to direct you to the section of the reviewer guidance where you can find additional support. So that brings us to the end of this short webinar. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you found it useful. We'd really like to thank you once again for coming forward to participate in this reviewer training. We really do appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.